Thank you for being with us and for your time. I'm gonna start with the direct questions about the impact of long-lasting conflicts on people and on refugees and on their needs on different groups of refugees and displaced people. For example, we have different needs for women, children, elder people, etc. So I'm going to start with you, Mr. Pierre.
Thank you so much, Iman, and thank you for the opportunity, first of all, to join this panel together with Filippo Grandi. You know, every day around the world, some of my colleagues in the International Committee of the Red Cross face the horrors of war. They are directly confronted with what it means to not having solutions to armed conflicts. And having worked myself in the humanitarian field for over 30 years, what I often struggle with the most is to try and convey to any audience what it actually means to face the horror of war when it happens in your own country. Wars are about the moment where you see in your village, on the hilltops close to your house, the enemy forces approaching. And you have just a few seconds to decide what you're going to take with you as you prepare to flee. What are you going to take? Some important family documents, some photographs that remind you of the life of your children, some personal objects that you are very attached to. What is it that you take with you as you prepare to? And in the moment where you step outside onto the space in front of your home, you suddenly remember that one of your children is at school a few kilometers away, and you are not sure whether you will reach it on time to take your child with you into exile. And you also don't know if this exile is going to be for a few weeks, a few months, or forever. And there are so many ways of describing why people have to flee and what the consequences of war are. But I have to say that working in the humanitarian field, working in the International Committee of the Red Cross, we are thirsty for new initiatives and more creativity when it comes to preventing wars and resolving them. It is unbearable to see entire communities experiencing the long-lasting effects of war. The ICRC has been present in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories for 70 years, in Colombia for 50, in Afghanistan for over 40. We need a resurgence of political thinking that thinks about resolving conflicts. The future of communities should not be reliant and dependent on humanitarian aid. It's reliant and dependent on political solutions, on economic outlook. And I have to welcome the fact that here in the United Arab Emirates, there is thinking about building bridges, about communicating. I'll close this part of the remarks by saying I'm often struck by the fact that in today's world, it sounds like in the political discourse, very often courage seems to be the act of not speaking to the other. When we work in conflict zones, we hear that all the time. We will not speak to the other side. But 10 years later, you will have to speak in one form or another to find the solutions, because these wars cannot be ever ending and cause the kind of traumas that you were referring to.
Thank you very much. And building on that, wasn't that the situation all the time, even in the past? Or is the situation now and nowadays worse? Mr. Filippo Grandi, also building on the impacts of this crisis on the people, on the refugees.
It's always a little bit risky to compare the past with the present. Was it worse? Was it better? You know, Pierre, besides being a good friend, is much younger than me. He spent only 30 years. I spent 40 years working in, so I have even 10 years more of experience. And like he knows very well, and he has said it, we've seen a lot in these decades. Pretty horrifying stuff. Think of the genocide in Rwanda, and what I was very much involved in that part of the world. Think of the wars in the Balkans. There's a lot about to be said about Ukraine, but even closer to Central Europe in the 90s, there was a ferocious war that displaced millions of people and killed many, many others. And the list is very long. So we are not, unfortunately, humanity is not new to horror. But what I think characterizes today's landscape is, first of all, and I go back to some of the points Pierre has already made, but to amplify further. First, you have a proliferation of crises such as we have not seen in a very long time. I think, and I'm quoting here his institution, not mine, they're the experts on conflict, that the number of active conflicts at the end of last year was about 120. That's enormous. 120 situations in the war where what Pierre described is happening to people. And where, because of that, people decide to leave their homes. You know, I always say, that's not even a choice, but it's a decision you have to make. It's one of the most difficult decisions. People think that it's easy to just say, I go to a safer place. You have to leave so much behind, but you have no other choice in that particular moment. And this happens in 120 places. In some places, for everybody to see, Ukraine, Palestine, and a few other places, in other places where nobody knows what's happening because nobody talks about that. So that proliferation, which is closely linked to the incapacity that we seem to have to face, to solve conflict, is a big feature. The other feature, of course, is the complexity of the crisis. It's not anymore just war. Very often you see climate change or the impact of climate change intersect with conflict, not to mention poverty, violations of human rights, collapse of institutions, bad governance in other way. All of this often combines in creating crises that are very complicated to address. And third and last, you know, we can talk maybe if we have a few more minutes about what to do, but in analyzing this, and again, I speak from the point of view of the organization that deals with the displacement consequences of crisis, but Pierre represents the organization working in conflict. The type of conflict has become even worse. The violation of international humanitarian law, which means that civilians are impacted or targeted, are increasing in full impunity, and that means that conflicts where civilians are targeted, where schools and hospitals are destroyed, are even more terrifying, and that's why people flee in much larger number. This is why we have now, in our statistics, 123 million refugees and displaced. This is a figure that we have never reached since the Second World War.
Wow. And let's go beyond humanitarian aid, because you mentioned Mr. Pierre before, and also as Mr. Filippo highlighted, sometimes like with this long-lasting conflicts, your mission and the humanitarian organization were supposed to be temporarily, and then we find them decades later still in the same struggle. You mentioned the importance of the political engagement in real solution, focusing on solutions. How to reach this? How to think outside the box, in your opinion, especially that some crises that force people to be displaced are not always from political conflicts or causes. Sometimes it's environmental, climate change, etc.
So the first thing that I'd like to connect with something that Filippo mentioned. One of the first things that happens in times of war is to dehumanize the other. And that's a natural thing, sadly, when wars happen, because we know how it can be just in an interpersonal dispute with your neighbor, you're unhappy about something. So when you amplify it to an armed conflict, it becomes very emotionally charged. It's aggressive for a whole range of reasons. But nowadays, with social media and the availability, the simplicity with which one can amplify negative and harmful messages about the other, the act of dehumanization is taking place on a scale that is very difficult to contain. And in this, we all have responsibilities to deal with this. Media institutions have responsibilities, political and state institutions. We cannot only say that every thought is and can be expressed and voiced, because some of the thoughts are so divisive, so brutal about the other, so withdrawing the humanity in the other. And yet one day you have to sit down again with the other to find the solution, to find the path. So in the midst of war, our humble role as humanitarians, look today at what is happening in this very fragile situation that has emerged between Israel, Hamas, and all of the focus on the release of hostages and prisoners. My colleagues in the ICRC are there on the ground facilitating the release on a daily basis, whenever this happens, of hostages and prisoners. This social media environment is extremely challenging to manage because of the intensity of the emotions that are attached in this very polarizing conflict. And so what we are calling for is also people to remember the humanity that is at the heart of each and every one of us. Because if we betray that fundamental principle that we are all bound by elements of humanity, we may not recover. And this links to your point, Iman. Look at what we inherited after the end of World War II. So the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions that are the rules that apply in conflict and that are supposed to protect civilians, prisoners, people injured, the Refugee Convention of 1951. I have to say, the people at that time were visionary, courageous. Why? Because they had just survived the greatest calamity that humankind had ever inflicted on itself, which was everything from the Holocaust to Hiroshima, from Coventry to Dresden. Everything had been seen, and we inherited these instruments. So before we undermine them, we better think about what would we replace them with if we think of a different future. And so I think it's very important that we do not allow our collective human family to have to go through another cataclysm comparable to World War II before we become wise again. Can we once be collectively wise in anticipation rather than in response to? And here I think moments like these gatherings are moments of inspiring one another. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Filippo. I don't know if you have any comments on this point, but also on the same of this political engagement and the necessity of political engagement. We have a political climate that is influencing the public opinion against the migrants and refugees. So how can we deal with these issues?
Well, on that specific issue of the stigmatization of people on the move, be they migrants, migrants are not refugees, but are people with rights, are human beings, and every human being has rights. And then, of course, refugees and others. There, I think what Pierre said about the enormous space that hate and discrimination have acquired in this social media context is something that we really need to think hard about. It's very difficult to counter this type of misinformation or hateful information, especially in situations where some politicians, without too many scruples, they utilize fear, they create fear around these and other issues to gain votes with the false promise of measures to stop the problem. In reality, the measures to stop the problem exist, but they have to be achieved otherwise, not through hate campaigns, barriers, and elimination of rights. But I want to add a couple of other points that I think are important, and to look at all this a bit more positively. In spite of this enormous proliferation of crises that we have mentioned, there are windows of opportunity, and some are small, some are bigger. And there are opportunities when crises, I'm looking at it now from the refugee angle. When crises are very prolonged and protracted, people cannot go back home. Some countries offer refugees approaches, policies, inclusive policies that allow this situation to go beyond the humanitarian response, which is always very short-term and dries up, and offer better options for people that have to wait maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years before they can go back to their homes. We've seen it in Colombia with Venezuelans, for example. Kenya has now embarked on a very courageous integration program for Somali and South Sudanese refugees. So it's important to support countries with few resources that try to do the right things. And then there are instances in which even maybe return to their countries is possible. You know, the future of Syria, and I'm sure that it was discussed here at this summit. I know the foreign minister of the caretaker authority was here. I was myself in Syria just a few days ago, and the situation is very fragile there. But there is an opportunity to create conditions for millions of Syrian refugees that have lived now for a long time, especially in the region, in the Middle East, to go back to their country. You know, we conduct surveys of intentions of refugees, Syrian refugees. Up to a year ago, those that said we want to go back within 1 year were less than 2%. After December and the change of government, already we reach 30%. People are watching, but we need to help them. Sometimes building peace is even more difficult than making peace. It requires resources. It requires a bit of risk-taking in investing in very fragile situations so that they don't slide back into conflict and misery again. Syria, in my opinion, with a lot of caution, with a lot of vigilance, is one such situation in which we can reverse this pattern, crisis displacement, and find solution and eventually, hopefully, an end to displacement.
Yes, thank you. Since we're running out of time, I just want to ask you this question for both of you. What do you recommend to address these issues of conflicts, displacement, and integration?
You know, yesterday was very interesting because there were several events here that were organized about artificial intelligence and how this is going to transform our lives. Digital transformation was mentioned. Each of our societies and institutions are marked by this, and I was impressed by, you know, the great spirit of innovation that you could feel in the rooms. People were imagining a future where certain things will become easier. And as I was listening to those conversations, I realized again, you know, that we have this phenomenal ability to think the world in better ways, but there is something deep in our human software that we have carried for millennia that lead us occasionally down the wrong path, to conflict over cooperation, to resolving things through violence rather than collective thinking. And there's something that strikes me about our very casual attitude, I'm sorry to use this word, in relation to armed conflicts. Look at how the world mobilized around COVID-19. Not everybody agreed whether it was right to vaccinate or not. Not everybody agreed which was the best vaccine. But there was a collective mobilization. Everybody understood that this was important. Where do we see similar mobilizations when it comes to armed conflicts? When conflicts happen, it's only about, I want to be right, I want to support one side over the other. Great. If polarization had helped resolve many of the conflicts, we would all be well informed. We need bridge building. And this is a way of not just thinking the future about artificial intelligence and how it will help us, our own intelligence. Can we reprogram it as well with the same energy and creativity? That's what I would hope for.
Thank you, Mr. Filippo.
Difficult to add anything, and I fully agree. But I would also say we live in a world in which the prevalent political culture seems to emphasize the interest of one's country. Fair enough. You know, this is what governments are about. They're supposed to take care of their people, of their country. But in a world that is increasingly faced with this type of challenges, conflict is one, insecurity, broadly speaking, but the climate crisis, pandemics, etc. You know, the list is quite long, unfortunately. You have to be able to couple, governments have to be able to match the interest of their own people with the global interest, because the boundary is very thin. And you can easily see that these solutions require global solutions, and again, working together. I was recently at another conference where I heard a minister from this region say something that I found very interesting. He said, we must move from confrontation to competition. Competition is healthy. Look at artificial intelligence. You know, we welcome a lot of competition to get the best solutions to help humanity through these incredible technological tools. But if competition becomes confrontation, then we run high risk that those tools will be used against each other, and then good luck to all of us. Because if confrontation goes progressively, as it is already moving, into the hands of artificial intelligence, think of how some of the aspects of the wars are conducted today, then our hope that even in war, things can be conducted in a manner that still respect the rights of people, those hopes will be dashed. So no confrontation, but healthy competition, which is another way to work together.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, Your Excellency Filippo Grandi, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Thank you, Your Excellency Pierre Kra, the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you very much.